Have a seat. Take a deep breath. Let it out. Okay, let me tell you a story. This man is named Tom Butt, but with 2 T's. If part of your mind is permanently 8 years old like mine is, the fact that his name is Tom Butt is a constant source of delight when Tom Butt is in the news. And you know, if that is your last name and you choose a life that's going to keep you in the public eye, having a giggle-inducing last name like that is probably both a blessing and a curse. I mean, sure, just like they have since elementary school, people make fun, they point it out to their friends when they see your name, right? But it's also a very memorable name. They also remember your name. And when you are running for public office, people remembering your name is a really important thing. I would say name recognition in this case is an asset, but his name is Mr. Butt, so I don't want to say asset. Sorry. In any case, nobody has to call him Mr. Butt anymore, because now what you should call him is Mr. Mayor. Last night, against all the odds in the world, Tom Butt was elected mayor of Richmond, California, a working-class, blue-collar city just northeast of San Francisco, where the oil company Chevron has operated a huge and sometimes troubled refinery for over a century now. A couple years ago, there was a huge explosion and fire at the Richmond refinery. It sent more than 15,000 local people to the hospital. And if you didn't like the time in 2012 when it caught fire and blew up, there was also the time it caught fire and blew up in 1999. And if you didn't like the time in 1999 when it caught fire and blew up, there was also the time in 1989 when it caught fire and blew up. That Chevron refinery in Richmond, California has been kind of a nightmare. And when the latest explosion and fire and thousands of people going to the hospital disaster happened there a couple of years ago, the city council and the mayor in that little city, in the more impoverished part of the San Francisco Bay Area, folks in that little city, their elected officials decided they wanted more assurances from Chevron. They wanted more safety precautions. They did not want to just wait for this refinery to catch fire and blow up again in their little town. The mayor and the city council started pushing Chevron. And so Chevron decided that they would buy themselves a new mayor and a new city council in that town. Buoyed by the Supreme Court's decision that corporations can spend infinitely, not only on federal elections, but also on little local elections anywhere in the country, the giant oil company Chevron decided that they would spend infinitely in Richmond. They would spend infinitely to elect their own preferred slate of pro-Chevron city councilors in Richmond and a pro-Chevron new mayor in Richmond. They dumped more than $3 million into the little local elections in this town to try to elect 3 new city councilors and to elect their own preferred candidate over Tom Butt. Tom Butt raised something like $40,000 total for his campaign as of mid-October. Chevron dumped more than $3 million into that town to defeat him. And last night, Tom Butt won. He beat Chevron. All 3 of the city councilors who Chevron spent all those millions of dollars to defeat, they all won. Chevron had more than $220 billion in revenue last year. They're one of the largest and richest corporations ever in the history of corporations. Chevron spent millions of dollars to buy themselves their own little city government in this small town last night. Their opponents had no way to compete monetarily with that. And nevertheless, those little Davids fighting that Goliath, they whomped Chevron in every single race in the city that Chevron was trying to buy. And now Richmond is going to have a mayor who one of the richest companies in the history of the earth has emphatically not bought and paid for. And his name is Tom Butt. And that happened last night. That happened last night. A lot happened last night. Last night, voters in the deep, deep red state of Nebraska, they had the chance to vote on whether they wanted to raise the minimum wage in that state. They voted yes by an 18-point margin in Nebraska. In Alaska, they voted to raise the minimum wage there by a 38-point margin. It was on the ballot in Arkansas, too, where it won by 32 points. Even in South Dakota, voters chose to raise the minimum wage, and they chose that option by a double-digit margin. there were 2 states where personhood was on the ballot last night. This is the pretty radical anti-abortion legislation that is favored by a whole bunch of the new Republican senators who were elected last night. Joni Ernst in Iowa, Cory Gardner in Colorado, Tom Tillis in North Carolina, Tom Cotton in Arkansas, Steve Daines in Montana. They all support personhood, this radical anti-abortion approach which would ban all abortion in every circumstance and some popular forms of contraception as well. But voters last night were asked directly in 2 states if they wanted to vote for a personhood law statewide. In North Dakota, it lost by 28 points. In Colorado, the numbers are still coming in, but so far it is losing by 30 points. Personhood lost by a huge margin in both states where people had the chance to vote on it last night. Last night, voters in 2 states and in Washington, D.C., also had a chance to vote to legalize marijuana for recreational use, like Colorado and did in 2012 in Washington State. In Oregon last night, they voted on it as well. They voted to legalize pot in Oregon, and it won by 12 points. In Alaska, they voted on it there as well, and it won by 4 points. In Washington, D.C., legalizing pot won by 37 points. In 4 places last night, there was a measure on the ballot to give people paid sick leave from work. It was on the ballot statewide in Massachusetts. It was also on the ballot in Oakland, California, and in Trenton, New Jersey, and in Montclair, New Jersey. Passed in all 4 of those places. When Rhode Island elected Gina Raimondo to be their new governor last night, it was the first time ever that the state of Rhode Island had elected a woman governor, and it was the first time that Rhode Island had elected a Democratic governor in 2 decades. In Massachusetts, when the congressional results came in last night, Massachusetts hit 100 straight congressional elections in which the state has elected Democrats to go to Congress. The Massachusetts Democrat who had the hardest fight on his hands last night, but who still won, was Iraq War veteran Seth Moulton, who volunteered for multiple combat tours in Iraq despite his own political opposition to the Iraq War. During his campaign for Congress, the Boston Globe caught Seth Moulton not being fully truthful with voters about his war record. What he didn't tell voters was about the medals he had won for bravery and heroism during his time in combat. He didn't think that's the sort of thing you should brag about, so he didn't bring it up. Seth Moulton is now a congressman from Massachusetts' 6th District. In Washington State last night, voters decided that they would not be bamboozled by the gun lobby. They voted in Washington State last night that you should have to have a background check if you want to buy a gun. They voted for background checks, and they voted against another measure that was purposely put on the ballot to confuse people, which would have banned the same background checks that the state just agreed to pass. Washington State voters were not bamboozled. Remember our old friend Scott Brown? He lost. He lost a Massachusetts Senate seat to Elizabeth Warren 2 years ago. Then he moved north to his vacation home to try to run again for the Senate from a different state. He lost last night. He is the first person in U.S. history to lose 2 United States Senate seats to 2 different women. Scott Brown, feminist icon. New Hampshire reelected Senator Jeanne Shaheen over Scott Brown last night. And at the same time, they reelected their Democratic governor, who's also a woman, Maggie Hassan. After some of the worst gun massacres in our nation's history, after Newtown and after the Aurora, Colorado movie theater massacre, the governors in the 2 states where those tragedies happened, the governors in those 2 states, in Colorado and in Connecticut, they defied the gun lobby. Those 2 governors, after those incidents, they stepped up to create background checks for gun sales in their states and to pass other sort of lowest common denominator gun safety laws. And of course, the gun lobby went nuts. The gun lobby swore revenge. The gun lobby screamed that it would be the end of each of those governors. Last night, even on a huge night for Republicans, including in the governor's races. Last night, both that Colorado governor, John Hickenlooper, and that Connecticut governor, Dan Malloy, who the NRA said they would have for lunch, both of those governors were reelected last night. In Colorado, incidentally, who John Hickenlooper beat was the guy who said he wanted to ban the IUD because in his mind, certain kinds of birth control make you basically a walking, talking abortion clinic. You're having abortions constantly. And so Bob Beaupre wanted to ban the IUD in Colorado. Bob Beaupre lost. John Hickenlooper beat him last night. In Alaska, in an effort to beat Republican incumbent Governor Sean Parnell, the Democrat and the Independent, who had been splitting the vote against Sean Parnell, decided in September that they would set aside their differences and instead run together as a unity ticket, a unity Independent and Democratic ticket against the incumbent Republican. Now, NBC News has not yet projected a winner in that Alaska governor's race, but with 73% of the vote in, the Independent and Democratic unity ticket is ahead there by roughly 1% at this point. For the first time ever last night, the Republican Party elected a black Republican woman to go to Congress. For the first time since the post-Civil War Reconstruction era, a state in the Deep South voted to elect an African-American senator in South Carolina Republican Tim Scott. West Virginia sent its first ever woman to the United States Senate last night. Iowa sent its first ever woman to either House of Congress last night. Seriously, Iowa? Seriously? 2014? In San Francisco last night, they voted to raise the local minimum wage to $15 an hour. And the sky did not fall. In Nebraska, the aforementioned deep red state of Nebraska, a Republican incumbent congressman there ran an ad that blamed his Democratic opponent for the murders committed by this tattooed face guy. It was the Willie Horton ad, but worse. That Republican congressman who ran that ad in Nebraska, he lost his seat last night. In Nebraska, Republican Lee Terry lost his seat. He'll be replaced by a Nebraska Democrat named Brad Ashford. And here is my favorite what does that mean development from last night. If Rand Paul wants to run for president in 2016, Rand Paul better be sure he's going to win, because apparently he's going to have to give up his seat in the United States Senate if he wants to do that. Republicans in the last few years have taken over basically all of the state legislative chambers in the South, except for Kentucky. In Kentucky, the House is still held by Democrats. Kentucky state law right now says you can't run for two federal offices at the same time. Rand Paul was first elected to the Senate in 2010. That means his Senate seat will be up in 2016. 2016 is also the year he wants to run for another federal office. He wants to also run for president of the United States. Under Kentucky law, he cannot do both. Can't run for both at once. The Democrats in charge of the Kentucky State House have said they have no intention of changing that state law just so Rand Paul can have the job security of keeping his Senate seat while he also runs for president. Republicans thought they would win that last state legislative chamber in the South last night. They thought that they would take the Kentucky House away from the Democrats last night. And they want to do that for a million reasons. But Rand Paul desperately needs Republicans to take that House in Kentucky. But last night, the Kentucky House stayed Democratic. Its partisan makeup was unchanged overall in last night's elections. The Democrats are still in charge of that chamber. And however much you agree or disagree with all the Beltway gushing over how interesting Rand Paul is, the decision that Rand Paul now has to make about giving up his Senate seat if he really does want to run for president, that really is the first truly inarguably interesting thing about the prospect of Rand Paul running for president. Or maybe not running for president. And that just happened last night. That all just happened last night. And I think that's it in terms of straws to grasp. Silver linings to spy in the clouds if you are not a Republican and you're trying to figure out what those election results mean last night. I think what I just gave you is the entire universe of things that just happened in the election last night that are not about the Republicans winning almost everything and everywhere they wanted to win.